Hey, this is Mike Lindsay, and welcome to episode 5 of the Off-Camber Podcast, presented by Specialized. This week's guest is Kristian Kibby. Kibby is most recognized as being the guy who puts down the power at the Geico Honda team. He's had a pretty interesting path to getting to that position, being that he was originally born in Australia, came over here in the late 90s and has worked for a multitude of interesting riders and a little bit different paths until he ended up at Factory Connection Racing in around 2004 when they first got the Honda CRF 250R. So he's been there since the beginning of that engine development. So he talks to us a little bit about the early days of those parts, the relationship at that time with Pro Circuit, moving into EFI, doing their own stuff. We really start on his little path to kind of getting there, and then really that whole timeline from 04 on with the race team. So you tech-minded individuals should probably really enjoy kind of that bit of timeline stuff. I really hope you guys all enjoy the episode in particular. Before we get started, though, I'd like to thank the three brands that make this podcast happen. We are presented by Specialized Bicycles. The all-new Turbo Levo gives riders the power to ride more trails. Check them out at specialized.com. Big one this week for Fox Racing. They just dropped their all-new V3 helmet, top-line helmet for them with fluid inside technology, MVRS 2.0, Verizor BPS, bunch of really cool technology. I've actually got 2 videos up right now about the tech of that helmet you can check out, and I'll also be putting up a first ride impression of it in the coming days. So check them out, foxracing.com. Also, those helmets are now available at shapmoto.com. They've got 3 colorways they've launched with, a white, a black, also zebra print, and there's some cool limited edition gear you can pick up there. Shop Pro Motorsports has been in this industry for more than 30 years. Dirt bikes, quads, side-by-side, parts, accessories, you name it, they got it. Throw in the code ML512 at checkout to save yourself a few dollars on your next purchase. Now let's jump into our conversation with Kristian Kibby. Hey, this is Mike Lindsay. Welcome to another episode of the Off-Camber Podcast presented by Specialized. My guest this week is Kristian Kibby. A little bit different than having a normal racer on. I've got someone who has a ton of experience in the industry, but in a little bit different field. We're currently sitting in the meeting room of the Geico Honda race shop, somebody you've worked for quite a while. Just get a short background before I let him explain. Transplant from Australia. Has worked for this team for multiple years. What's technically your position, Kibby?
R&D director.
R&D director. So most, I guess, guys from Australia I've run into that have come into the motor industry in the U.S. side seem to always come with a racer, whether they've been a mechanic, a trainer, something of that situation. They've come over with somebody. Basically, how did you end up here?
It was a little bit similar to coming with a racer, but so in Australia, I worked for a team as Suzuki. Would have been 97, 98. During that time in our Supercross series, we had some Americans that would travel over and contest the series. One of those was Mike Jones. So I got to know him well during those times. I would prepare not only my regular rider's bike, Cameron Taylor, but then I'd also quite often prepare a bike for the visiting American Mike Jones. I think there might have been some other guys that had come over during those years as well. But anyways, got to know Mike well, and of course being a big fan of the sport and motocross being what it is in the US, I wanted to come check out the scene here. So I actually came over with Andrew McFarlane and did Binghamton and Steel City with him at the end of 97. And we stayed with Mike Jones. Mike organized borrowing a bike from Morgan Suzuki, an RM125 for Andrew McFarlane. I traveled with Andrew to the last 2 nationals, kind of checked everything out, and got to know Mike pretty well during that trip. And he kind of offered for me to work for him in 98, but I'd already had commitments back in Australia. And we kind of stayed in touch, and I came back 12 months later to start the 99 season, which Mike was racing arena cross for Team Green. And so that started end of 98 with the 99 model bikes.
So basically, what's your background in moto? You grew up racing, and what's like, I guess, especially around the era of when you were growing up, what was racing like in Australia? What was popular? Because I think for you guys, flat track's always been a pretty big deal, or dirt track or flat track or speedway per se has been big down there. Moto, what did you grow up trying and doing?
So the club where I started racing was in Canberra. They were really big into flat track. They had motocross as well, but most of the key members of the club were kind of more flat track oriented. Motocross was kind of growing, and there was a bunch of the guys at the club that put time into building a motocross track and getting that going, but it wasn't their primary thing. But we'd travel around to other tracks nearby that were more motocross focused. But for a while when I was on 80s, so probably 1986 through 88, kind of 50-50 flat track and motocross. So I grew up racing since I was probably 12. A little bit late getting into it. I raced BMX before that. I didn't race, the 50s and the 60s. It wasn't until 80s. But yeah, I was always around, like Wayne Gardner raced it when he was a kid. He raced at some of the tracks we raced at, and then there were guys that went on to be successful road racers, like Matt Mladen was a year older than me. Anthony Gobert was a year younger. There are always people to.
Was that like because of a good flat track background for your guys' area? Was that a little more common to see guys actually move more towards like road racing eventually than seeing some of the guys you grew up raced and maybe continue on to like a professional motocross or supercross level?
Yeah, I think just at that time. So a few years later, I moved to another city, Newcastle, and there was more motocross happening there, and that's where the Craig Anderson and Chad Reed and those guys are from. But even those guys raced flat track when they were younger. I'm not sure what it is about the flat track. You could probably get into the whole history of it, but I know, even speedway, there were plenty of speedway, venues around, and the sprint cars and speedway bikes, and then maybe the dads were racing speedway and the kids would race flat track on 80s or whatever. It was just racing anything in the dirt. There was just a lot of it in the areas I grew up in. I'm not sure why so much of the flat track. But yeah, the flat track guys quite often went on to be good road racers. Yeah.
So from that, working for the team you did in Australia, being kind of a smaller tight-knit group, did you get more, say, full experience work on bikes from every aspect at the time? Would you say, is that your first learning curve, or were you always a pretty technical guy on your own bikes even growing up? Or
yeah, I'm the product of a divorce, and I had some other friends in high school the same way, and so we didn't have dad around doing stuff for us. We were lucky enough to have mini bikes, and I had a couple of friends. I had one friend that was like really curious and would dive in and take on some pretty big tasks, and we'd read all Dirt Ride or Motocross Action or whatever when we were young, and if there was a tech article on how to do something, we'd tackle it. And we were pretty young and we were doing top ends and changing wheel bearings and all sorts of things. But then after high school, I had totally different career plans, and they didn't pan out for a couple of reasons. I was going to go the college route, and the college acceptance didn't go the way I wanted to, and I didn't want to move to the city where I got accepted. So I kind of hung out and just went surfing for a while, and then I ended up just having to go get a job, and so somehow I kind of stumbled into a automotive mechanical apprenticeship. And so then I ended up working at a Range Rover dealership eventually. I spent some time at a Mitsubishi forklift place. But all of it kind of provided a good background. I learned something at everywhere I was.
Wide range of mechanical experience.
Yeah, there were even times, we'd supply forklifts on site, and, I'd be driving forklifts down the freeway or down the highway at least, to deliver them to a site, or they break down on site and you'd limp them back to the workshop. But yeah, I kind of hated it there, but looking back, I learnt plenty there. But then I quickly moved over to working on cars as soon as I could, and we didn't have, I guess per capita, there was a handful of motorcycle shops which I wanted to be at, and I'd applied, but there were just no openings at that point in time. So anyway, worked on cars, fiddled around with my own cars, went through a phase of kind of hotting up your own car, and I built some kind of unique vehicles along the way. I was into rotary powered things for a while, all the while racing 125s by that stage. But so I had a background where, I could build a car engine if need be. And it was common to do clutches and head gaskets and things like that on the 4-stroke car engines. And that's where you'd learn all the basics with, valve timing and whatnot, which later served me well when motocross turned from 2-stroke into 4-stroke.
So once you came over to the U.S. full time, I mean, was it just kind of like, heck, you just wanted to do it? Did you think that you were basically going to end up transplanting and staying here? Did you have much of a game
When
plan?
I first came here, I thought I'd come for 2 or 3 years and kind of elevate, my knowledge on the motocross side. Gain some sort of in-depth knowledge where I could come back to Australia and be better at being the race team mechanic. I kind of felt like it was a rapid rise, but within a year or two, I was working with guys that were top 3 in the country, and I kind of wasn't going to go anywhere until I was 10 or 15 years older and could potentially be a team manager. Like that middle ground, you're young in your 20s, team mechanic, or you're 30 and older and you're team manager, but there wasn't a lot going on in the middle.
You just had to just drudge it out.
Well, and I've never wanted to be just kind of, I don't know how to say this right, but I just didn't want to be average, right? If I'm going to do something, I kind of wanted to be the best that I could be. So I thought if I come over here and kind of work my way up and gain all this knowledge, like, oh, this is how things are done at the elitist, or at the most elite level of the sport, in my opinion. This is how you would build the bike for someone that's winning AMA Nationals. And if I came home with that knowledge and then was constructing motorcycles in Australia, I think that was my initial plan. But again, this is the plan of a 22-year-old, right?
Changes a lot once you get here.
Well, yeah, like I guess at that age, I thought I was going to get to somewhere and like, okay, I know it all now, I can leave. But that's never the case, right? You're just continually learning.
You kind of forget about the part where everything else is advancing, so there's always something to learn every year.
There's new products coming out, there's new techniques, or you're just continuing to, find things and prove other beliefs wrong that you initially, attacked something in this manner and now you're doing it a different way.
So once you came over here, you came over as basically, in a blunt sense, a mechanic. How many years did you work around different riders and stuff? What was your first team gig here in the U.S.? And what was kind of in between?
Yeah, so went through the arena cross season. That was just driving a stretch van or whatever, like a lot of the arena cross guys used to do or might still do, pre-sprinter. So then Mike Jones didn't ride outdoors. And so when it got to that summer of 99, he was going to go do some one-off events for purse money in Europe and stuff like that. So then he was actually kind enough that he had heard someone else had contacted him that a team was being put together, Planet Honda, and that they might need more mechanics for the outdoors. So I ended up getting a job with those guys. And I got paired with Ryan Huffman, 99 outdoors on a CR250. And so that was out of a dealership team based out of Michigan. And so we were centrally located in Michigan. And we had a team minivan and kind of chased the team semi to all the events. All the mechanics would ride in the van, stay in the hotels. And that was, that was summer of 99. So that was kind of the first team gig. The way that team operated, it wasn't quite on the level of a factory team. Like I said, it was more of a dealership team with kind of off-the-shelf sponsor product. Stayed with those guys for the entire 2000 season, and there was a changing of roster with the riders, and coming into that team was Matt Walker for the 125 class. I think Ryan was off the team at the end of 99. Back then on the team, there was Jason McCormick, who had some success in 99 on the Planet Honda 125. He did okay at a bunch of nationals. John Sebastian Roy from Canada.
Came down.
He was on the team. We had some good results. There were some good guys on the team. Later, so I worked for Matt in 2000, and I kind of got the option to choose to work for him, and I was impressed with seeing him as a 125 privateer in 1999 on a YZ 125. He'd got a couple of top threes here and there, and I'm like, if you can get a top three in the outdoors on a privateer 125, you're doing all right. But yeah, it was a rough year for Matt. He got injured at the first East Coast race.
Was he as interesting to work for as I would think from what I've seen of him?
Yeah, we got along well. We spent a lot of time together. We actually stayed at Ezra Lusk's house a lot leading up to the season. So that was another, for me, I was, kind of fanboying a little bit. It was cool to hang out with Yogi and see, what his preparations were. But I actually think Ezra ended up getting injured at that point, so he wasn't doing as much training and whatnot as you might in a normal circumstance. So anyway, later in 2000 I ended up doing some wrenching for Jason McCormick and Isaiah Johnson, I believe, for a little while when they were doing like opposite coast 250 stuff at the end of Supercross. And then we got back on track with Matt in the outdoors. So it was kind of like my first team thing. But then again, I kind of wanted to move on up from them and, get with a team that was doing things more in depth, more factory parts, more engine work or whatnot. I almost, when I went through a phase like 01, 02, I was almost going to throw in the towel and go back to Australia. I was applying for jobs and wasn't getting them. Probably just didn't know all the right people, Michael Byrne was over at Emmig's Edge Kawasaki team. I was trying to get a foot in over there. I knew Billy Whitley pretty good through the Arena Cross series. He was running the Primal Impulse, Bill's Suzuki team. I was close to maybe doing something there. But yeah, Mike Jones had then given up racing and started doing freestyle. So I actually, he offered me more money than what the teams were offering. And so I kind of took the money for 01, 02 and built freestyle bikes.
Polished up frames, anodized a bunch of stuff, throw ape hangers on everything.
No, Mike was sponsored by Pro Circuit for pipes and engine work and suspension. And I would go down to Pro Circuit and I'd get our frames powder coated flow green like the race bikes, and we would polish up the swing arm like you would with an old Kawasaki, get all that gray paint and the black primer off. And I was prepping my freestyle bikes like I would a race bike. And, other guys' bikes looked like skateboards, with just stickers slapped everywhere, and they'd go down, and everything.
How many stickers can you throw
and
on a front number plate and a side
plate?
plate?
All of that. We ran ours a bit cleaner, looking like it was a race bike, and that's a whole other conversation. Eventually, a lot of the freestyle guys, Metzger was one of the first ones that started, kind of hot rodding his bike, and he had his own kind of style and started making them look good. You had the other guys that were kind of BMX skate kind of background, that they didn't really care what their bike looked like, and it's kind of gone full, I don't know if it's full circle, but I know a lot of the guys in the last 10 years, when they were younger, they might have aspired to having race bikes, and a lot of those freestyle guys didn't ever get to that level in racing, but once the money started coming in and they could afford it, they were going and buying kit suspension and getting coatings done and having very nice looking bikes, which I think is more the norm these days.
Yeah, you look guys like Twitch and Levi Sherwood, they definitely take a lot of pride in the bikes they got.
I'm impressed. A lot of those guys, Mike Mason.
Mason always builds really nice ones.
Yeah. A lot of those guys have really good looking bikes nowadays. But yeah, I think Mike and I were one of the first to have a pretty good looking, clean, nicely, presented bike.
So was that your first experience? Because before that, between the van and the van life with My4, the minivan, it seems like you didn't have as much of a permanent address. So doing the freestyle thing, was that more your first permanent tenure out here in California, or?
Yeah, still kind of we're based out of Mike's place but that was at Steel City in Pennsylvania. But we'd be on the West Coast during winter. So it's still no real permanent address until 03. At the end of 02 with Mike and a bunch of other moto both riders and industry people and whatever. A lot of people were involved in the Charlie's Angels movie that featured some moto. I was on set, myself and John Mitchell were the mechanics maintaining that fleet of motorcycles for that movie.
So let's throw it back. When you came over from Australia, did you ever expect you were going to end up working on a movie set on dirt bikes?
No, I hadn't given that any thought. So anyway, during filming, I got to know Nick Way pretty well. And he, like a lot of the riders there, I think it was motocross had ended, and a lot of guys in between shooting were kind of on their cell phones piecing together what's going to be their upcoming deal for 03. And I don't know if it started off joking or serious or whatever, but Nick and I got talking, and I ended up pairing up to work for Nick in 03 because while Mike looked after me very well, 01, 02, racing was my passion and that's where I wanted to be, and he knew it. And yeah, I couldn't my hands were idle. Like I didn't even change a clutch all year. You know, I changed handlebars, subframes, some broken wheels, broken spokes and stuff or whatever.
A lot of polishing. A
lot of plastics, scuffed plastics, and yeah, a lot of sticker replacement and polishing. But yeah, anyway, we didn't rebuild engines or nothing was wearing out, and it was a lot of driving because he was, we had a big motorhome thing and we'd take it all around to, there's a freestyle here, a freestyle there, and you know, you'd go everywhere, wherever the money was. So it was a lot of driving. But also, wherever I'd go, it was a good time. You know, wherever I'd go, I'd pull into town, I'd get to do some riding myself. You know, I went dirt bike riding a lot of good places through that. So anyway, 03, I get onto Mark 1 Yamaha with Nick, and we get some leftover factory parts, and we're back racing, and I'm back on track with kind of what I was setting out to do.
Nice. So first team, where were you guys, was that then permanently based out here for the year?
We kind of just based out of Nick's garage for West Coast in Corona, and worked out of the team semi that was, you know, garaged nearby. And then I got myself a house in Michigan, and I would go back to my house with the race bike, you know, whether it be the engine or the suspension or the complete bike, depending. A lot of the outdoor nationals being kind of centrally located from there. Mark 1 didn't have a race shop. So I would take my engine home and rebuild it, and then travel back to the race truck and assemble my race bike before the weekend. And that was kind of a normal, you know, outdoor series.
So was that a little more enjoyable, actually getting your hands per se dirty with different racing, like actually being able to go through and other than just stickers and clickers like the year before and polishing? Yeah,
I was, you know, again, you know, I was working with Enzo suspension, Pro Circuit engines. I was communicating with the guys, Bob Oliver and actually Jay Haynes. They were over at Yamaha. I communicate with them on, you know, certain things. And I was back, you know, in the mix, and I don't know, I was absorbing, learning, you know, all of that. All that stuff that kept me, you know, inspired and kept me moving forward. Whereas the freestyle thing was a bit more hanging out, you know. But yeah, I was back on track, and it was also enjoyable. You know, we were running in the top 5 most of the year. I think we might have got some thirds here and there, or fourths. But, you know, running 5th and 6th, and I'm looking around, and it's all, you know, I'm just surrounded by factory guys, and I'm, all right, this is where I had set out to be, you know, as a kid leaving Australia.
What was it like working for Nick? Because I know Nick in his later point of his career was definitely a little bit finicky with the bikes, always trying different stuff. Was he like that even in Mac? Were you getting a nice little education and testing with him at that point?
I think more stuff was at his disposal later on in his career. Yeah, he'd bounce around, like he couldn't quite decide between, you know, 2 sets of forks, and we ended up like trying to split the difference, and said, look, I'm kind of tired of changing. There was a point in time we were changing fork springs between the motos. And we didn't have a suspension technician. I'm doing other, bike prep between the moto, and then I myself, the mechanic, which is kind of unheard of these days. You take the handlebar mounts off the Kayaba, so you could take the top cap off and pull the spring. And, we were doing this for hilly tracks or flat tracks or whatever, up a spring rate, down a spring rate or whatever. And I said, look, man, let's just call this and split the difference and let's be done with that. It's a little much. But no, there wasn't too much else. I knew as a rider, when I get on a bike, I like the throttle to feel perfect. I like the brakes to feel firm. Just all smooth controls and stuff. And so I stay on point with all of that stuff, and he was pretty happy. But as far as getting into a lot of changes, I didn't find him that finicky. We did some preseason testing, I guess, in selecting engine and pipe and jetting and reeds and all that kind of stuff. I guess he was particular and just knew what he wanted, but it wasn't like we were going to try 25 different things and continually search. No, it was good. He got a little reputation later on, but it wasn't like that.
So where'd you go at the end of that season? What was the options?
Well, then Nick ended up getting a ride at Suzuki for 04. And initial talk of him bringing a mechanic, Suzuki were like, no, we have all of our mechanics that have been here many years. That's not really an option. So I knew right away, pretty early on, that I should start looking for a job if I didn't want to stay another year at Mark 1. And so again, I always had this thing where I wanted to go up to the next rung on the ladder. I was always trying to pursue something. Mark 1 not having a race shop, not having, suspension technicians in-house and, engine crew chief type guy and all the rest of it. I knew that I kind of wanted to keep moving, keep learning. But what was interesting, we raced with Nick, I guess I forgot about this part. So 02, 3, 4, that's kind of the time everyone in the bigger class, whether you want to call it 250 class, 450 class, whatever, is trying to figure out if they want to be on a 2-stroke or a 4-stroke. So he thought he was going to race the, whatever it was, YZF 426 or, was it, it was a 450 that year.
450, yeah, because it
had to be a 20.
400 was what, 90?
It was a 450. I didn't have to deal with the 426. It was the 450.
Yeah.
And so anyway, I built those for outdoors. And so we went to the first 2 outdoors, and then Nick did decide that he wasn't that into it and he wanted to go back to the 2-stroke. So that was a lot more work there. So that was one thing. But what was also interesting throughout most of that season was Nick would finish, whether it's qualifying or moto or whatever it was, he would finish in front or behind Mike LaRocco 9 times out of 10. And Shane Drew was Mike LaRocco's mechanic. So Shane and I would be going to the gate, going to staging, prepping gates or whatever, near each other pretty much the whole year. So I kind of got to know Shane. And you see other guys in their bike prep or whatever. If I got someone, staging behind me all the time and I see his bike's kind of scruffy or whatever, you kind of notice. Not saying Shane's was. Shane's was good. So anyway, 03's done, and I get a call from, or I might have even started out with a conversation with Shane, and then Andrew Hobson was at Honda as well, an Australian guy that I knew who did some 2-stroke development and would make cone pipes and stuff. And those guys get talking to me about what I'm going to do in 04. Well, then they're telling me about Honda is going to come out with the CRF 250, and that Factory Connection's going to need someone to be their 4-stroke engine builder. And that sounded like something I was into. I knew that at some point I would like to specialize and not be power washing, doing grips and graphics. I knew at some point I'd like to, hone in on whether I was specific to a suspension task or an engine task or what have you. So anyway, that conversation continued, and there was going to be some shuffling around. I think LaRocco, Shane wasn't going to work for LaRocco. Shane was going to come to Factory Connection and be like some sort of technical lead, a crew chief type person. And so he was kind of actively looking to put the crew together, but then it didn't come to fruition because I ended up still coming to Factory Connection. But Shane never came over. So anyway, long story short, I came on in 04 at FC, end of 03, just to assemble CRF 250 engines.
Hey, we're going to take a quick break from our conversation with Kibby. I really just like to touch on the 3 brands that make this podcast happen. Every one of these episodes is presented by Specialized Bicycles. They've got a lot of great equipment. Pretty much if you can think of any type of mountain bike, road bike, triathlon, everything in between. They have a huge range, huge amount of models, huge amount of build kits. Check them out at specialized.com. A lot of guys in this sport, a lot of riders use the Big S's bikes because they put in a lot of support into this sport. So if you're in the market for a bicycle and you want to support a brand that supports the sport, check them out, specialized.com. They said Fox Racing is also another big one, and this week they did just drop their all-new V3 helmet. There's a ton of technology packed in this thing. It's a new top-of-line helmet for them. Chase Exon and Ken Roxon debuted it at Supercross last weekend in New Jersey, and all the riders will be in it at Vegas. And as they line up for Hangtown, there's a ton more airflow in this helmet, so those guys are going to appreciate going in outdoors on, just like I said, a lot of really cool technologies. Check them out, foxracing.com. You can also get that helmet and some pretty cool limited edition zebra gear they did as a throwback to like the Bradshaw, Rick Johnson days at shapmoto.com. Chaparral Motorsports, they've been in the industry for more than 30 years, whether it's quads, side-by-sides, street bikes, dirt bikes, helmets, boots, parts, accessory, exhausts, you name it, they got it. Check them out, shapmoto.com, and throw in the code ML512 to save yourself a few bucks on your next purchase. Thanks for letting me do the plug here. Everybody, enjoy the conversation with Kristian Kibby. So you end up finally here at Factory Connection, and that's where I think it's interesting is kind of how 4-stroke development basically starts. So you come over the first year, there's a 250F. You're just kind of starting at technically as an engine guy and as your specific field now. What was it you were assembling at the time? Was it supplied by Honda? I know there was always people, they got stuff from PC. Like, basically, where were you getting all your stuff to put those early ones together?
So I think, I don't know how this came about, and this is just my hunch, right? That at that point in time, you still had a lot of 125s on the gate. You had Yamaha 250Fs, and a lot of the guys running the Yamahas, there weren't that many engine mods going on. You might do a little bit of a regrind on a cam, high compression piston, port job, pipe, but it was really minor. Like a lot of guys would run them stock with a pipe and, not do a lot. I think it was the team's belief that they really weren't going to be modifying this bike very much. And the initial tests that on the pre-production bike that I hadn't been involved in, it was prior to me coming to the team. I think they'd done a bit of riding with Chris Gosler and Travis Preston. And those guys would kind of just like, the stock bike, hands down, it's better than our best 125. And so that first year in 04, they hadn't even given up on the 125, right? Because they still sold it for another 2 years after that. That Honda wanted the team to campaign 2 250Fs, 2 125s. So we came into the season, I was just going to be building engines for 2 guys, and that it was Gosler and Preston. And so when I first got here, it was go through the parts book and get all these replacement parts, get what you're going to need. And we were looking at like, okay, we're going to need X amount of stock pistons and stock valves, and like if you look at it these days, there's a lot of stock parts we don't even order. But back then it was just order all this stuff that you're going to predict that you need. And we didn't even know service intervals and things. Everything was entirely new. So you kind of had to error. There were some guidelines from Honda Japan. We recommend you do this, and most of it was very frequent.
So especially had to be unique. Putting them in Supercross the first time probably really brought up either issue.
Yeah, so like 04, Anaheim 1, we were even struggling to get parts. The new bike comes into the country, and then the warehouses aren't really up to speed with like every single part. and or for a race team where we were still probably going through the dealer network and getting our parts from the same warehouses, and we're ordering certain parts in a high quantity, and they're not prepared for that. But yeah, that Anaheim, we had a pipe, and I think we had preloaded the stock springs, valve springs. We had stock cams, a ported head, light flywheel, and just gearing, and maybe some heavier clutch springs or something, because all the clutch stuff was very 125
derived at that point.
Yeah, derived, and there was a lot of changeover parts that would work. But yeah, that bike was very, very stock. We ran a stock ignition box in 04 through Supercross. It wasn't until outdoors that we had a CDI box for it. So anyways, 04, I rebuilt the engines, and we did a little bit of, there was the option to run some Works Honda parts, but there was maybe enough parts for one guy, not the whole team. And so then it was recommended that we, form an alliance with an aftermarket company that could help develop the engine and pipe and whatnot. So that ended up being Pro Circuit, because that carried over. They were helping with 125 anyway. So again, I had the opportunity to work with those guys closely, the guys down at Pro Circuit, and it was in their best interest too to build a product line to sell to CRF 250 customers. So in theory, they could tap into our riders and all of our Honda parts and equipment, and develop their line of Honda products. And at a certain point, they would draw a line and say, okay, boom, this is what we're going to put on the shelf. And then we would continue that development, I guess infinitely, for what we're going to race. 2000, by the end of 04, somehow, I don't even remember how it all transpired, but by the end of 04, it was pretty evident that everyone wanted to be on the 4-stroke or needed to be on the 4-stroke or whatever, and the 125 kind of fell away, and the guys that were supposed to be racing that somehow were then allowed. We lined up at Hangtown with 4 250Fs. But
so your work doubled.
Prior to Anaheim, the game plan was 2 and 2, but somewhere through Supercross, it transitioned into just having 4 250Fs. Then through the outdoors, we made some, modifications. And then in 05, I was building the engines and helping with the development. But I think by 06, we kind of figured out I can't do both. So then that's where Michael Fallon's started building the engines, and then I moved over to doing I wasn't doing all the modifications, but I was working with Pro Circuit and or other companies that were providing assistance with.
So PC at that time, that would have been when Mitch hired TRD. I always forget how to say his name. Drino.
Yeah.
I always mess up when I say Dino for some ridiculous reason, but Drino, because he had originally come from TRD. So did you work with him quite a bit, or?
A little bit. I don't think that was. I had the opportunity to have many conversations with Drino and absorb some knowledge from him, but that wasn't necessarily the protocol, me to go direct to him. I think, the late Dave Chase was the service department manager down there. And so Mitch has his race team guys for the Kawasaki side of things, and then Dave would handle a lot of the liaison with other teams that Pro Circuit supported, that being us. So between Dave and Mitch, I would communicate with them. So I would more or less go through them, and then they would speak with Drino if it was relevant.
Yeah. So 05, then even in 06, like basically what the modifications that being, where'd you guys end up focusing on the 250F development? What parts kind of got focused on? Where'd you guys put your effort and your resources?
I think it was mostly just top end reliability and breathing. There's through 04. Honestly, that carbureted model, pretty much every year, the cylinder head was significantly different. 4, 5, 6, 7. 250F started with pretty large ports, And then, 4 years later, we were making far more power with smaller ports. And there was a lot of camshaft development and valve spring and valve development and all of that to build a reliable bike that could, sustain high revs for long periods of time. And I think the top end was most of our focus, just figuring out the 250F and getting it to breathe well and achieve the power curve that it ended up being able to achieve.
What year did you guys finally approach it a little bit different with suppliers, that you guys started sourcing less from Pro Circuit and going out and dealing with your own suppliers? What year did you guys kind of decide that needed to be the direction?
I think we broke away in 2011, but we'd been thinking about it since probably 2007 or 8. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was just tricky. We started seeing, the riders would question. It went both ways, though, because I hear stories down there, too. People could never understood the relationship. I think the relationship was pretty up and up, and it worked well for everyone. But it started it was more of a placebo effect, if our bikes would get hole shots quite often, and there was plenty of things left up to our own control. We would dictate what carburetor and what fuel we run and what jetting we're going to do, and what CDI box we use. They were doing a lot of pipe and piston and some engine hard parts. But Langston's down there trying to win a championship, and if a Honda hole shots him and he's stuck behind it for 2 laps, I know he's kind of saying to Mitch, like, well, why do you help these guys? They're beating us, or they're not beating us, but they're fast. Why I see them down here and you're helping them? Why do you help them? They're fast enough. And then at the same time, we had family around our riders or our actual riders. They were like, how can our bike be fast if those guys are giving us the parts? They're obviously just going to give us the parts that are their part minus a percentage. So a lot of the concerns were probably unfounded, but what can you do about placebo effect? It's definitely a thing in motocross that you got to feel right about things. But yeah, anyway, we'd been thinking about that, and if we did go our own way, Ziggy, Rick Zilfelder, the team owner, he's always wanted, not to bite off more than you can chew, and kind of the team's kind of grown at a steady pace. You do see a lot of teams come along and they do a lot of things soon, and then they're not here for the long run. And so we were just plugging away, and if we're going to break away and do things on our own, there would be certain infrastructure that we would need, in this building, more staff or more equipment or whatever it was. So tapping into another supplier and partnering with them and utilizing some of their services, it wasn't a bad thing. And if we were going to make a go of it, we needed to be ready and have our race shop built up accordingly.
Is that the shop we're in now? Speaking of which, when did you guys? Because that's a question around that timeline.
We did kind of go our own way and choose our own vendors and whatnot prior to moving into this building, but that's another extension of that. I think we moved into this building in 2014. But yeah, we started kind of doing our own thing a little bit more. We changed pipe supplier in 2012, I believe, 2011 or 12. But see, that was part of it too. So 2009 was the last carbureted bike.
Well, that's where I was going to get to, your stressful off season from 09 to 10, because you guys got that bike late, right? The first FI bike?
Yes. Yeah, we didn't get that until almost Thanksgiving, I think. Yeah.
Remember, we've talked about this once before, how, you guys showed up at A1, go back to almost what it was years before. You guys showed up to A1 with a fairly stock bike, right?
Not to the extent of the years before. But we lost power. 09, we finished that generation with a strong bike. And then the 2010 bike came, and we lost overall peak power, but we got EFI. There was no hiccups, there were no stumbles.
Way more consistent.
Way more consistent, far more rideable. So luckily Supercross is not drag racing. And although we would have liked to... So in a perfect world that you could completely control, you would have had the 09's power and you would have had it fuel injected. But that's not what happened. So anyway, we went backwards. We took a few steps forward and had to take a step back at the same time. And luckily it was a very rideable bike with the EFI, and we had good riders. And we had some success in 2010, more in the outdoors, where Kennard got an outdoor championship on the bike. But that summer, it was not a fast bike. And we were trying. And that's probably where we started thinking more and more about how do I phrase this? I don't know. If we just had, unlimited potential and we could just do whatever we wanted and tap into whatever resource, and it wasn't a conflict to go here or there or whatever. What could we achieve?
Yeah, I would think even from timelines, you're not on someone else's schedule. You always are with a supplier, but if you're not going through somebody that then is going through a supplier, if you're kind of more that dealing that, you can even shrink down R&D times, try new stuff, everything.
And honestly, I don't want this to get misconstrued. I'm not saying that we were getting the short end of a stick or whatever from suppliers we were paired with at that time, but it was more like they had responsibilities to say 3 or 4 teams, and there's only X amount of days in the work week, and what percentage of their dedication were we getting? And so then it's only normal that if we are doing it ourselves, that then we are able to work on it 20 hours a day if we can live on 4 hours sleep. And so that's kind of the approach that we took later on.
So from your personal want of always wanting to improve yourself, were you personally pretty excited? Like, was it kind of a conversation when you guys sat down, like a moment where it's like, okay, so you have freedom per se, we're going our own, pick supplier, like that was it? Was it a slow transition to that, or was there actually a set thing where it was kind of like, this is the direction we're going in, per se, the freedom expanded for you and it started another chapter of
I think it was a slow transition because, behind the scenes there are a lot of common vendors between different manufacturers. You might design things a little bit, different. But, Kawasaki, Yamaha, Honda, we might all kind of go to a same supplier for a certain part, but, there's NDAs assigned with that company, and, we have the freedom to have input on the design of that part. But no, it was still a slow change. We didn't make drastic changes. I think it just meant that we just put more time into our own product. We just did more hours. If you're partnered with a company that, they have to come up with some stuff for the new year model production bikes that are released, that's their retail side, that's their bread and butter. They're going to focus on that. Then, they've got their own team to focus on. They've got some other teams that they help to focus on. At the end of the day, we needed to put more focus on our own machine.
So good.
No, you're fine. I was going to say, in doing that, that was like one of the highest pressures. That off season we carried the most pressure on us. And going into round 1, it's like, okay, did we make a big mistake in doing this? Did we take a step forward, a step back? We better show up and move in the right direction.
So how was the first season, you would say, that you guys had that type of control. How did that first season go? Like thinking of the entire year, how it went from performance, reliability, durability, dealing with stuff. Was it?
We made a stride forward with the bike, but we're also very lucky that we had 2 riders that were also hitting their stride in their career too. And we actually came away, I believe that was the year we got both.
You got
Supercross titles.
one.
Yeah, and Tomac. Yeah.
So that whole generation, because even though there was 2 generations of Honda 250s kind of in the time span, I'm thinking of the engine itself wasn't really architecture-wise a huge change all the way from 10 to...
Oh.
Yeah.
10 to 17 was basically the same architecture.
Yeah, so you got to deal with that for quite a while, but definitely it'd be interesting because you go from the first part of that generation, you go from dealing with Pro Circuit, then you guys transition more into your own development, but then you had so much time to work on that. After a while, you definitely have... Were you surprised how long you guys were able to... You were still able to make improvements on that engine after you had already been working on it for 3, 4, 5 years? Were you initially thinking we were going to run out of ideas or improvements to make?
Yeah, I kind of thought we were plateauing 14, 15, but we found some improvements 15, 16 that kind of blew my mind a little bit. But we would shift focus a little bit, some years I was more focused on peak power and we're like, okay, peak numbers are good, let's try and focus on retaining that and having more bottom and mid. Then after that, maybe we'll focus on right now we have to service them at this interval. Can we make them more robust and go longer service intervals? Or we had a couple DNFs. Let's eliminate those DNFs and make those parts indestructible. It's always kind of shifting the focus. Basically, you sit down at the end of the year and go, okay, what can we improve upon? What was bad? What was good? But yeah, towards the end of it, we made some improvements and was like, wow, I really didn't think we were going to get to here. I thought we were done.
With that time span, even though you had all that time to develop it, did you ever have any riders that per se challenged you, like they're looking for something specific, like somebody that, I want to say somebody like, even though you guys, if you had pretty much everybody on the team happy, did you ever have, during that time span, do you ever have anybody say go, no, like specifically push you guys for a certain feel or a certain amount of power somewhere?
Yeah, we struggled with starting a lot at the end of most of the way through the carburetor era, but then we later, at the end of that generation, we found that there were 1 or 2 things that we were kind of doing wrong, and it was an area that we hadn't really explored that we found contributed hugely to starting. But then back to the 10 to 17 generation you were talking about, with regard to riders, we had a lot, we were working heavily with amateur riders, and so we'd had kind of this amateur spec, and then we would bring them to the pro ranks and we would ride the pro bike. There were some times when someone like Barsha, who rides pretty aggressively, his lap times weren't better on the pro bike sometimes. And so then we had to reevaluate and figure out what's going on. But it kind of came down to a smooth rider that uses finesse could have a bike that's a bit more aggressive. And then a rider who's already aggressive might pair well with a bike that's kind of toned down and they don't have to respect the throttle control. And so it turned out what our amateur bike was, that the setting was a bit milder in its acceleration, and then that actually had merit in some applications on the pro side. So, and that kind of was brought about by a particular rider saying, hey, this is supposed to be the fast bike, but I'm not getting the lap times. And we're like, okay, yeah, it's fast, but it's in the delivery. So I guess you could say that rider needed a certain thing. And then Blake Wharton on the team, he was always an interesting one because where most small bore class riders, whether it be a 125 or a 250F or whatever, they're quite happy to rev the bike. And Blake more often would not run the bike in as high an RPM as anyone else, and so that required a bit of a different approach for him. Can't really think of too many other guys. It's one reason why I do kind of enjoy working in the 250 class, because typically more is more, and at the end of the day what you're pumping out of a small engine, it's kind of impressive. And then I feel like in the 450 class it's more you're just trying
power.
Yeah, you definitely need power. Yeah, you need the overall power, but you're definitely finessing it and moving it around and organizing its delivery, and it's not as easy just to straight put your finger on, because a lot of it you're trying to communicate with a certain rider and get a certain feel out of the bike.
So a little fun project though is right around the end of that generation, you guys, or the team per se, had gone more and more invested in amateur riders, basically how early they reached them. I mean, Trey's deal was one of the earliest we'd seen at the time, moving into Barsha Beshega, et cetera, but then you guys get into actually having the little 150 riders. That bike at that time, personally, you guys hadn't fielded one. It had been around for a few years, but nobody was aggressively developing it to race it, and you did quite a bit of work, got to bring some unique things out. How fun was that after the years and years of developing that same package and looking for tenths every once in a while to getting to start from complete scratch on such a unique little bike?
It was fun, and yeah, if I had a crystal ball to see how much work, I probably underestimated what was going to be required. But again, something wrong with me where I'm always trying to go up another rung on a ladder or whatever. I'd seen that bike being campaigned by others, and it didn't really impress me. And it didn't, I just wanted it to be like our 250, just a junior version of our 250. And the ones that I'd seen looked like a YZ400 or something shrunk down, not our current CRF 250. And that, not to Yamaha, but I should say, it looked like an old, it was carbureted. It looked like a coughing and sputtering 20-year-old 4-stroke. I just wanted, it was like, okay, it's whatever year it was. When did we start doing that? 2016 or something? It's like, okay, it's 2016. If we're going to do this thing, I just want it to be like our 250 race bike. I want it to be like crisp, and I want it to bark, and I just want it to be bitching. I don't want to do this and it just be mediocre. If we're going to do it, I want it to be the best one that's been done. So it just started as that.
So list. Custom fuel tank. You had to do fuel pumps because you had to turn EFI. I believe you used a CBR 300 throttle body or something. What were some of the unique challenges developing that little guy?
I don't know. So you start with EFI, and all you need is a couple of sensors that the ECU needs some information from. So it kind of wants water temp sensor, which it really only needs on initial startup. It needs an air temp sensor. Needs a crank angle position sensor, needs a manifold air pressure sensor, needs a throttle position sensor. But a lot of these are all incorporated on the throttle body anyway, so it's not as complex as it sounds. Like 3 of those are on the throttle body. You got the injector itself. So you just link all that up with a cut and shut 250 wire harness and a reprogrammed 250 ECU. I did a lot of calculations on, okay, if we had a carbureted bike and the gas tank was this big, I looked at the older Hondas and I could see that when they went EFI, they shrunk the gas tank by 20%. So then I knew that we could have a smaller volume gas tank, and it would be, the end result, the gas tank would be kind of slimmer. I looked at throttle body sizes and carburetor sizes, and so like a 250 went for 250F went from, I want to say, a 38 mil, maybe 40 mil carburetor, and then when it went EFI, we were 46 to 50. So I'm like, okay, we've got whatever size I forget, the CRF 150 was probably like a 28 millimeter, and we ended up going to something like a 36 or whatever. throttle body. I'm looking around, and I come to find, all right, there's a CBR 300, which I believe is a 2-cylinder, and it was fed by 2 of these things, and I'm like, well, that's a pair of 150s. Just piece all that together and kind of glue it all in place, and kind of... The biggest thing was the ignition cover, which I think we'd intended on making one from scratch, but what we ended up running the whole time was just one that was had some additions welded onto it. But we had to put in the ignition cover. We housed the 250 stator to generate the power for the EFI bike.
Oh, so speaking of the EFI era, I think it's just barely becoming more obvious to the general consumer how important mapping is. We're just getting to the point that some X-Race team guys are doing consumer mapping now, and it's like I try to explain to people when I do a review, and I'm like, man, it's something I've only felt when I've ever gone to test a team's race bike. How crisp, how responsive, how connected they feel at all RPMs. Even when you guys first went EFI, how big of a learning curve was it to map, and when would you say you started taking the most advantage of mapping? Were you really getting your head wrapped around it in 10, or how many years before you'd say you really started to buckle down on that aspect?
Yeah, it's something myself and our tech coordinator Josh is our go-to guy for the data acquisition side of things, and he and I discussed this a little bit, but I don't know, this is a long-winded answer. It definitely wasn't in 2010. It's going to take a few years, and then you're figuring out, so the level of mapping. We use Vortex ECUs, and there are so many layers of what you can manipulate. So there's base maps, and most guys kind of get into fiddling with some base maps. You do that on the fuel side, and you can do that on the ignition side. And it's then, how do you come up with that map? Is that from track information? Is that from dyno information? Is that merging the two? Do you get your information for top end from somewhere and bottom end from somewhere else? Is that load tested? Then, is that in cold climate, warm climate? Is your calibration through different weather situations? Is that keeping your bike in a constant, equal state of tune? There's just so many layers. Then you get into acceleration, enrichments. There's so much. And so in the early days, I think you kind of focus on the meat of the work, the basics, and then as the years go by, you start delving into other areas. So to answer your question on that, that's still evolving, but maybe the growth hasn't been as rapid since, I want to say, like 10 to even 15, that we were still learning a lot as we went, because there's not too many places where you can learn. Like, even the manufacturers of these components, they're kind of experienced in mapping or replicating what ECUs can do on stock bikes, and sure, they can make some improvements, but then there's some race situation stuff that they might not be aware of or they haven't experienced, and so then the race team's got other things that they want to adjust for. There's so much with the mapping. It's constant. So you look at other forms of motorsport, and their throttle trace is much calmer than supercross or motocross. If you showed the throttle trace on our data to someone from a car team, they'd just be, what? Like, this is a problem. He's on the gas, off the gas, on the gas, just roll on the gas or whatever. It looks nothing like. So then, from the car racing world or the motorcycle road racing world or whatever, those guys might have had 10, 20 years or more jump start on using EFI and doing their own mapping. but you can't even lean on them if they wanted to talk to you, which is one. Motorsports racing, it's kind of a secretive community, secret society. Even if you get into a conversation and I've come across someone who could be a mentor, they're probably coming from another background that I'm like, hey, when you go off the dragon back, and I go dragon back to table and then step off and go 2, 3, 2 and take that right hander and then go whoops, spine into whoops. See the throttle trace? What do you think, what do you think I should do? He'd just be like, what? What's going on?
They're used to seeing a lot more curve on off, a smoothness that
I'm like,
mash.
Yeah, see over the dragon back to the table, it goes rich lean. Like, do you think that's base map or enrichment or what? Someone from the car racing world, I don't know. They might eventually come to terms with it, but I think on initial looking at it, they just feel like, what are you guys trying to do? So having to come to terms with EFI in what I think is probably one of the most extreme environments, everyone in the motocross community that's doing mapping, I think kudos to them. It's and not only then there's rider safety, like everyone out there doing it. There's a lot of factory teams that have obviously all the R&D behind how they develop the production bike in the first place, and so they might have much better methods or experience in how to do their race bikes. But then you go to all the other teams out there that are taking things into their own hands, all the satellite teams and whatnot. To put a good functioning EFI bike out there in a supercross environment, it's gnarly. There's a lot going on.
One I've always been interested about is kind of the current trend of so many riders doing the facility style training compounds, and I've kind of seen a little bit from being at someone's back east, like how the teams have gone about rotating the stuff now, where 450s you're a little more spoiled with the service intervals where it's almost like a complete bike goes in and out. Of course 250s, that's not as doable because of the engine package. How big of a strain has that been for you guys motor department as more and more riders, because you definitely have had quite a few on your guys' team, especially even currently right now, how many of them do that? What's that been like for developing a practice spec, and what kind of strain did that add to your guys' program?
Yeah, this is something I looked at a lot and I could kind of see coming, where we might sit back and say we had a new sponsor come in, or we negotiated so that we had a greater budget to work with for the following year. And then quite often it was viewed like, okay, we've got more money to spend, let's get this high-end part, let's get these high-end parts. And I kind of, this is probably as far back as 08 or something, I could see that we needed, race bikes were, I kind of viewed them that race bikes were fine. What if we could have as good as the race bike every day, midweek? Because there was a time where the practice bike was a lesser level, at least, I think for most people, in those early 4-stroke days. And then, so we looked at, okay, let's have more of the existing parts. Let's have a greater supply of those so we can change them at greater frequency. There can be less risk. The longer you use something, say you figure out you might have had a failure at 20 hours. So now we're going to change them 50% before. We're going to change them every 10 hours so that we don't risk getting anywhere near 20 and hurting someone. Well, then it was like, that's going to require twice as many parts, so let's get that handled. So yeah, that came from probably the facility days where they're like, hey, I'm down and, coach has, scrimmages going on today or whatever. So I don't know, you have to adapt and change your policies in-house, but that's not something really you can do on the fly. That's with a view to next season, or however you're going to lay it out. You might be able to do it, okay, so our goal is 3 months from now we're going to implement this, or but yeah, I guess just the challenge has just been identifying it and focusing on the key areas.
For people that wonder like what the difference between practice and race is this day from just like a rough percentage standpoint, what's the difference between a practice and a race spec for you guys these days?
These days it's the same.
It is.
It's the race stuff is serviced more frequently. The practice stuff, we try to have it run for about 3 weeks, whereas the race stuff, we'll open it up weekly, which doesn't mean we change everything. We'll inspect it weekly. And there's a handful of changes that are going to go on with that. But yeah, just the practice stuff just runs for a little bit longer. That's all. And a lot of that stemmed from when we had LaRocco in management. He was coming from the rider's perspective. He was a big advocate for having your practice bike feel as close to the race bike as possible, to have that, you're not trying to adapt to something new.
Speaking of that, just basically even have that kind of funding to do that. Grab that. Just even from the sense of funding, good. Just from the sense of funding, everything I see here, do you ever just like literally turning and looking at the size of the shop? I don't want to say lucky, but just you were talking about wanting to work your way up. Do you ever feel like you hit the large percent of what freedom you guys have here, what the owners allow you guys to continue to develop and buy and do and everything?
Yeah, for sure. When you stop and take a moment and look around, definitely.
Because I think most people are. I've been in about everybody's race shop, and this definitely is above the factory team. Even the factory forfeit, the OEM owned teams, this is above that.
Yeah, it is kind of crazy. Well, to be fair, some of the 450 teams, they've kind of they've got their corner of what is the OE's, major warehouse in, the Los Angeles area or whatever. They don't necessarily have that much square footage to work with. The fact that we have 3 team owners, and so one of the team owners had some cash on hand to make an investment, and so when the economy was a little down in California, there were some big warehouse buildings like this one, what it originally was, that he was able to take advantage and purchase it and then fit it out, and with all the work bays and a bit of a different layout to what it was originally, some sort of really big machine shop, fitted out to accommodate the race team, and paint it all nice and bright. It used to be kind of grubby when I first looked at it here. It was a little bit greasy everywhere, and now it's all bling and white and red doors and stuff for Honda colors. Yeah, it's good.
So yeah, I always want to end this one on a more of a personal note for you. So all the travel, cool places you get to go to. What just noticing from your IG, what I don't know, when you go city to city for Supercross, what keeps you per se? I don't know if I want to say coming back, but just like rounds arounds, like what do you enjoy about all the sightseeing? Because I noticed you're definitely like to wander around taking some cool stuff.
It went in waves for me. So originally I traveled everywhere, did a little bit of sightseeing, and I kind of thought that I'd seen everything in a lot of the cities that I'd gone to. And then a few years go by, and I stopped venturing out so much, and whether it was I was trying to save money or I was just being lazy or whatever, kind of just hang out at the hotel and wouldn't really get up too much. But I don't know, some sort of spirit of adventure came over me in recent years, I guess. So I kind of, I don't know, maybe in my old age, I've become a bit of a history buff or something too. So I like to check out some different sites in cities, and there's some US cities that kind of trip me out where you can go to an establishment that's been open since 1840, or it's a bar that's been operating for 150 years or whatever. It's cool stuff to see. And then into that came again, economic downturn. There's a lot of factory buildings and things all vacant, and now a lot of breweries and restaurants and things are all popping up in them. And I like to eat, and I like to wash dinner down with a beer once in a while. So been venturing out, checking out some good spots to go to in most of the cities that we visit, and I don't know, it keeps it interesting, keeps the travel interesting. For a while there, it's just airport, hotel, stadium, back to the hotel, back to the airport, back home. Keeps it good.
Last 2 or 3 seasons, what's the most interesting thing you've run across? Location?
Oh, I don't know if I
idea.
can come up with that on the spot. Honestly, like, when Will Hahn was on our team, he did a lot of cycling for training, and, you know, I grew up racing BMX and stuff, but I hadn't been on bicycles in a long time. I kind of got back into cycling, and I like some of the cities that we go to, actually, whether it be just, you know, rent one of those goofy bikes that are locked in, like a downtown area, some sort of urban bike, or whether it be organized and getting some, you know, downhill mountain bikes when we're at Lakewood, Colorado or whatever. I like, you see a lot more of a city when you're either on foot or cycling rather than, you know, driving. And you see more when you're on a bicycle because you cover more ground. I don't. To answer that, I probably like Colorado and Utah, but probably just because they're two of the places I've done a lot more pedaling in, and I get out and about and discover stuff when I'm on a bicycle. Quite often I'll see something on a bicycle that I'll kind of note, like, oh, we should come back here for dinner. I saw this cool place when I was riding past. So, yeah, some of the outdoorsy cities, I guess.
Cool. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Off-Camber Podcast, make sure you hit subscribe. It is available, of course, here on YouTube, and it is also available on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, pretty much all those normal podcast networks. You can go there if you just want to listen to audio and subscribe to it, so you picks it up every time we put out an episode. We try to do these weekly, and we have some pretty cool ones coming up. Road race guys, mountain bike, some endurocross off-road, some stuff like that. So we're going to have a little bit more of a mix of guests in the upcoming future. Got some good ones for the next few weeks, so make sure you stay tuned. And also hit subscribe if you like bike tests, shootouts, tech info, anything like that. This channel has it.